Tonight on The Late Debate, scrapping the handouts which help Londoners prepare for ULEZ.
If Sadiq Khan wants to expand the ultra-low emission zone, at least help make sure that it doesn't hurt the poorest in London.
Covering up when we open up, how many will keep their masks on public transport? Plus, ugly scenes at the stadium and online racism. We'll be discussing the fallout from that final. Good evening. In 3 months' time, the ultra-low emission zone will be extended out from central London to the north and south circulars. If you drive an older vehicle, it will cost you £12.50 a day to enter the zone. City Hall was offering grants to help some people buy new vehicles, but most of that money has run out. It's a good time to be in scrap. At this yard in Wembley, cars are piled high awaiting their turn in the crusher. Business is booming thanks to the proposed expansion of the ultra-low emission zone. Owners who can are taking advantage of payments of up to £2,000 from a Transport for London scrappage scheme.
Some of them it's like losing a baby. They start photographing the car and they're upset about it. Others just take it and say it's one of those things, the car's got to go, even though it's a good car.
London's ultra-low emission zone was introduced by the Mayor in 2019. It covers the same part of London as the congestion charge zone. But in October, the ULEZ will expand to cover a much wider area, every road inside the north and south circulars. For Bobby, a self-employed maintenance worker, it means trading in his car or more likely looking for work away from London.
I'm going to lose probably a lot because I pay for the car £2,000. I can't take 200 now, so I have to buy another one, 5, 6, maybe 10,000.
Near the North Circular in Barking, the ULEZ is costing this breakdown recovery firm millions of pounds. Big tow trucks capable of hauling a bus or lorry come with a £250,000 price tag. Smaller vehicles in the fleet also need replacing.
I can understand what the Mayor's trying to do, but I don't really think he understands the impact it has on some of the businesses. A business like ours, where we've got a number of vehicles to replace, we've struggled through COVID, turnover's down.
Transport for London had 3 scrappage schemes, but those for vans and minibuses and heavy vehicles have run out of money.
The scrappage scheme needs to be expanded. We've identified that there's the business rate reserve, which we could use to fund £50 million of further scrappage schemes. That's needed. If Sadiq Khan wants to expand the ultra-low emission zone, at least help make sure that it doesn't hurt the poorest in London.
The Mayor points to findings by Asthma UK and the British Lung Foundation.
More than 500,000 Londoners are now registered with asthma, including myself. And the new research shows that 2/3 of sufferers say their condition is made worse by poor air quality.
When the expanded ULEZ arrives in October, TfL estimates 100,000 cars will have to pay the £12.50 a day charge. Joining me in the studio to discuss that are the Labour MP for Erith and Thames Bede, Abena Opongasari, and for the Liberal Democrats, the winner in last month's Chesham and Amersham by-election, Sarah Green. And joining us remotely for social distancing reasons is the Conservative MP for Harrow East, Bob Blackman. Welcome all of you. Abena, is it time to postpone the expansion of the ultra-low emission zone?
The reality is, as you've just seen in the footage by the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, we've got a real problem in terms of air pollution, which is rising in London and across the country. It's something that the government has said is one of the priorities that they want to address, and it's something that really needs to be addressed really seriously. In terms of what we've seen in terms of the low emission vehicles from 2017, we've seen about 40% to 80%.
But off the back of the pandemic, wouldn't it be a good idea just to give people a breathing space before bringing it in?
I would say that the Mayor of London has been supporting a lot of businesses during the pandemic. He's been doing quite a lot more than what the government has been doing in terms of that, and this is something that I've been raising in Parliament about the gaps in support for businesses. But the thing is, we really need to do something to address air quality concerns and rising pollution. People are dying as a result.
OK, let's ask Bob. Your party opposed the expansion in the mayoral election, but of course Sadiq won. That's given him a mandate to go ahead with it. Do you now support it?
I think the key point here is that the people on the lowest incomes are, because they tend to have the oldest vehicles, and equally those that depend on their cars, vans and other vehicles will be the ones paying this charge. It won't be the better off people who can afford to replace their cars, every 3 or 4 years. So actually this is a really bad tax, because the people that are least able to afford to replace their vehicles will be the ones that are really surcharged and hit.
But Bob, something's got to be done to clean up London's air.
Yeah, but just give you an example. For example, very close to me, I have the Swaminarayan Hindu temple at Neasden, which is just inside the new ULEZ zone. That means that all the people going to that temple will end up paying that fee if they're driving older vehicles. They're only going 100 yards, literally, off the North Circular, but they will get charged. It's just ridiculous. And
Sarah,
I think
your
think again and come back.
Your constituents, Sarah, in Chesham and Amersham, live outside, but I'm sure a lot of them drive in. Is there much anxiety out in the home counties about these charges appearing in London?
Well, I have to say that it hasn't come up yet. That doesn't mean to say that it won't come up, but I certainly haven't been contacted by anyone. It didn't come up in the by-election on the doorstep. But I think, as has already been mentioned, we know that air pollution is a cause of early death, and something has to be done. And Liberal Democrats broadly support the schemes that are in place, and we know that some of them are working. But I'd be interested to speak to some of those businesses that are affected in the area to see how they're affected by it.
Is it fair, Abena, for motorists, drivers in London to wonder if there's a war being declared on them with charges and also bike lanes appearing?
I wouldn't say it's a war being declared. As Sarah's mentioned, this is about air pollution. I just wanted to go back to Bob's point as well. Recently he's been talking about smoking and his concerns about health. This is also in line with the fact that air pollution is something that affects people's health. More and more people are getting asthma, more people are dying. I also want to point out to the fact that in terms of vehicles with low emissions, what we've seen from 2017 is there's been an increase from about 40% to 80% of people that have low emission vehicles. So it isn't going to be a huge amount of people that are going to be affected. The government has been calling for this in terms of addressing air quality, air pollution. Something needs to be done.
Bob, it was Boris Johnson, when he was mayor, who first suggested an ultra-low emission zone. Nobody's come up with a better idea, have they?
Yeah, the key point here is that actually the worst element of pollution is when you've got queues of traffic belching out noxious exhaust fumes. And actually what we need to do is to get London moving. So instead of blocking up roads and causing traffic chaos, actually what we want to do is get the vehicles moving so that they're not sitting there idling. I completely agree with policies that stop people idling at curbside and such like, but having this ultra low emission zone right now seems to me to be the wrong approach, because what we're going to do is penalise, and I come back to this, we're going to penalise the people that are least well off. How is that fair or reasonable in London? Now, I think quite clearly the mayor's not, if he's going to go ahead with this, he's got to use more of his budget to enable those people who desperately need to replace their vehicles and can't afford to have another scrappage scheme, because otherwise those people are going to be unfairly penalised.
OK, Bob, let's move on to something that could have been asked by Southwark's most illustrious inhabitant. To mask or not to mask? That is the question, as step 4 of the government's roadmap comes into effect next week. On Monday, Boris Johnson gave the green light to step 4 of the roadmap. But for anyone hoping to throw away their mask, there was a caveat.
We expect and recommend that people wear a face covering in crowded and enclosed spaces where you come into contact with those you don't normally meet, such as on public transport.
Expect and recommend is not the same as you must. 48 hours later, Sadiq Khan decided compulsory was better than advisory, and masks would still be mandatory on London's buses, tubes and trams. In Parliament, Labour stepped up the pressure on the Prime Minister. Andy Slaughter said only 36% of adults in Hammersmith and Fulham were double jabbed.
So will the Prime Minister think again before recklessly removing all barriers to infection and transmission on the 19th of January? Will he keep the regulations on mask wearing and, like the Mayor of London, keep fighting the virus until it's beat?
But the PM seized on his confusion over dates.
As for his criticism of the roadmap, Mr. Speaker, I respectfully point out to the honourable gentleman the month is July, not January, Mr. Speaker.
The MP for Eltham told the Prime Minister about a constituent called Jackie whose immune system can't develop COVID antibodies.
Jackie wants to live as normal a life as possible and to do everyday things like going shopping, but she's terrified. What's his message to people in Jackie's situation? Will he rethink his reckless gamble of lifting all these restrictions on Monday?
I'm sorry, obviously, for the condition that Jackie suffers, and I think that the Labour Party obviously needs to work out whether it's in favour of going ahead with step 4 or not.
From Monday, London commuters will face different rules on different parts of the transport network. And Sarah, that's something your constituents know about, because if you jump on a train at Amersham, it could be a Met Line underground train where you have to wear a mask, or a Chiltern Line train where you don't have to wear a mask.
It's really confusing, but I have to say the Liberal Democrats are calling for masks to remain mandatory on public transport, and I personally will.
That's strange for a party that's in favour of liberty and individual choice.
It's the harm principle, isn't it? And I personally will carry on wearing a mask. I have to say that the Prime Minister has not listened to the science before, and my fear is that we'll end up having a harder reaction later down the line rather than sticking with what we know is working at the moment. So I personally will be still wearing a mask, partly out of common courtesy.
Abeno, you'll be wearing a mask?
Yes, I'll be wearing a mask. I think the Mayor of London has taken the right decision. He's listened to Londoners. We saw the polling last week which showed that a high number of people want to continue wearing masks on public transport. I've been contacted by constituents of mine who are worried about the restrictions in terms of the fact from the 19th of next week. They're worried about the fact that they feel that things haven't been safe. Not everyone has received a jab. And also one of the things I also wanted to point out, in my constituency, I have 2 boroughs, the COVID numbers are going up. What we've seen in the Bexley side, 50%, it's been increased by 50%. On the Greenwich side, it's been increased by 25%. So we really need to do something to curb those rising numbers, and wearing masks is the best way really forward.
Bob, you've spent a lot of lockdown shielding. You hadn't been into Parliament. Labour says the move to the step 4 is reckless. Are you nervous about it?
I think most Londoners are nervous. The majority of Londoners are nervous about using London Transport, full stop. The very few times when I've been on London Transport, the compliance level has been poor, in my experience, with the requirement to wear a face covering. So I don't think there's concern here. The key here is, of course, that 86% of people have had their first jab. A large percentage have had a second jab. And if we're not going to start easing the lockdown now, the question is, when do we do it? We need to remember that wearing a face covering does not prevent you from catching COVID. What it does do is reduce the chances, if you've got COVID, of transmitting it to someone else. So from that perspective, I think it is common sense and common courtesy to wear a face covering when you're in a crowded environment. We also know that this virus is airborne. So if you're, I think people have got to use some common sense here. If you're sitting in a crowded carriage, just out of common courtesy, you should wear a face covering anyway. But if you're the only one in the carriage, it doesn't make sense. Why should you have to wear a face covering at all? And I think where we've got to get to is actually get people to exercise more and more common sense in this approach. Because one thing we do know is we're going to have to live with COVID for a very long time indeed. We're not going to eliminate this virus completely. It's not going to happen, and we need to cautiously approach the lockdown as we're doing right now. So I think from that perspective, exercising common sense, getting people to exercise common sense. The other issue I would just say is, obviously London Transport one thing, But during the whole lockdown process, I've had to go into supermarkets for shopping and so on. And I'm afraid to say that compliance in supermarkets has been about 50%.
Okay,
so
Bob, can I stop you there?
I
just want to ask Sarah something. You raised the issue about common sense. Letting people have the choice if the train carriage is empty, you don't have to wear a mask?
Well, conversely, plenty of people rely on public transport to get into work and are getting onto trains which aren't empty. And I think it's those circumstances where actually making sure that people feel safe on their route to work when they're getting on public transport. I think that harm principle applies.
Can we turn to something that held the attention of all of us, not just in London, but in the whole country on Sunday? Of course, the final at Wembley, but perhaps more pertinently, the scenes that took place afterwards, the rowdy behaviour by those fans who tried to storm into the stadium, and some of them successful. Bob witnessed it. Abner, you were at an earlier match. Can I ask you, Abner, did the Met lose control? Is it another problem for Cressida Dick? Maybe her contract shouldn't be renewed?
I just want to say firstly that the scenes at Wembley were absolutely appalling and was carried out by a small minority of individuals. I also want to thank the workers that were there, because I was there last Wednesday watching the England match, and I saw stewards working really hard, and also the police as well. I think it's right then that an investigation is taking place into this, because what happened was unacceptable, and there were 19 officers that were injured. So it'd be, I hope they have a speedy recovery. But we really need to find those individuals that carried out that, because they essentially ruined what could have been the end of a beautiful match, because that's now dominated the media. That chaos that's been caused by a minority of individuals.
Bob, what did you see? You weren't actually in the stadium, but you witnessed it from a distance.
No, I live very close to the stadium, and I was responsible for the redevelopment of the stadium in the first place, and lobbying government to get a brand new stadium there. So I went and saw the scenes along Wembley Way, just really to sample the atmosphere. I wasn't successful in getting a ticket, so I went home and watched it on TV, as most people did. But what I did see was people that had been drinking all day. They were clearly inebriated, and most of those people wandering around actually weren't ticket holders. The thing I would just take up with Abner, to be fair, if you look at that stadium on TV, the capacity is just over 90,000. It was supposed to be only 60,000 people in the stadium. There were a lot more than 60,000 people in that stadium. There was hardly any empty seats at all. And unfortunately, there were a series, it wasn't just one or two people, but there were a series of brief break-ins through the security cordon. And one of the problems, and I think this is part of the review that has to be taken, is it wasn't the Met Police that were responsible for much of that. It was stewarding inside the stadium, because the police weren't doing the stewarding inside the stadium or inside the stadium area. It was Wembley Stadium stewards that were taking that role on, and frankly, they weren't trained to deal with crowds in the way that the Met Police are trained. And that's something that has to be reviewed, because if we're going to get events like this again, and we are obviously looking forward to hopefully a successful football season again, we can't have that going on again. And so from that perspective, let's review it. Let's make sure we understand what happened. Absolutely bring those responsible to justice, and make sure that we are not looked upon as people that tolerate football hooliganism. As someone who followed football, I'm a football fanatic. I've followed my team all over the country and all over Europe. And unfortunately, I've seen scenes like this all over the place.
What I was going to say is that I think the FA and the Met have questions to answer, but you're right, there's an inquiry looking into that. But what I did want to say is that it's not a true reflection of football fans in this country. The vast majority are law-abiding citizens who enjoy a good game. Like the day before, I was in a local derby, which was a grassroots local rivalry between Chesham United and Amersham Town, and that went to penalties as well. It was a brilliant game, and what you saw there were families having a fantastic day out, and that is football in this country. It's not a few hooligans dominating the headlines and spoiling it for everyone else.
Abena, what worried you most about Sunday? Was it the violent scenes or the aftermath and those appalling racist comments that appeared on social media?
I think it's a mixture of both. To be honest, those racist comments on social media were absolutely appalling. To be honest, I wasn't that surprised. I get abuse on social media because of the colour of my skin.
Not because you missed any penalties?
Not because I've missed any penalties, not that I'm aware of. But I do think that with the online abuse, something really needs to be done about it. We just need to call out racism when we see it. And I just feel that unfortunately it's taken something like what's happened to the footballers before we're really having a discussion about this. I've been trying to discuss this for quite some time with a number of colleagues about the fact we need the government to really look at the online harms bill to make sure that tech companies, social media companies have a requirement to make sure that this is not this is addressed and that they take robust action, particularly on social media. Because it's kind of being normalised, this kind of abuse, you know, the expectation if you're from a particular ethnic minority background that you should expect to have that abuse. It's unacceptable and it's disgusting.
Bob, can I ask you briefly, your party's got a problem, hasn't it? It doesn't quite know where it stands on things like taking the knee.
Well, I think the issue about taking the knee, unfortunately, I think where we got to with this is that it's seen as a gesture by many people. And I'm not quite sure what the players expect to do as a result. I mean, I would much rather see big efforts to get black players, particularly at the end of their careers, getting their coaching badges, going on to become coaches, becoming managers, becoming leaders in the game, not only as great footballers, but as great leaders in the game. And I think that's something we have to do as positive. I absolutely condemn the vile racist abuse that those three brave young players took when they stepped up to take a penalty when some of their seniors weren't willing to take a penalty. You know, they should be applauded for their bravery, not condemned for missing, well, having their shot saved in the end. I also think, and this is something that's really important, I think, going forward, those three young players need to have, I think, some counselling and some assistance because they are now going to suffer quite strenuous abuse going into the next football season. Neville Southgate will remember what it was like. Chris Waddle, Stuart Pearce,
Bob,
others.
I'm going to have to interrupt you there, I'm afraid, because unfortunately, as always happens, we have run out of time. So thank you to all my guests tonight, to Abena, Sarah, Bob. I'll be back in September with another edition of The Late Debate. Until then, thank you for watching and good night.